Molt bé. Molt bona tarda. Gràcies pel respecte. Perdó. Ara. Bona tarda. Moltes gràcies per respecte amb el que han escoltat l'himne europeu que ens agermana. O sigui, és molt satisfactori pensar que hi ha una melodia que ens fa sentir membres o partícips d'un mateix projecte de civilització, de pau i de progrés per Europa i confiem que també per la humanitat. En tot cas, moltes gràcies, benvinguts en esta nueva sesión. Estoy encantado de dar la bienvenida a todos ustedes, empezando por el honorable cónsul de Bélgica, que es el cónsul más dinámico que tenemos hoy en Barcelona probablemente, y con el que tenemos la fortuna de organizar este ciclo de conferencias de los que hoy es la segunda sesión. Bueno, el tema ya han visto, ha suscitado mucho interés, como era previsible, por el tema en sí mismo y por el ponente que lo va a desarrollar, que nos va a hablar de la iniciativa del Tratado de Paz. Les confieso que me tiene absolutamente intrigado, que tengo muchas ganas de escuchar su ponencia, porque inicialmente una obviedad. Celebramos el año pasado el 75 aniversario de la Declaración de Derechos Humanos, un monumento que era una historia de la humanidad civilizada, pero a poco que se reflexiona cae uno la cuenta que la paz es la condición sine qua non para todos los demás, que la Declaración Universal es una maravilla, era increíble que en aquella época se hiciera esto y que siga tan vigente después de 75 años, pero sin paz todo lo demás huelga y tenemos desgraciadamente ejemplos muy próximos en este momento en Europa, en Oriente Medio, etc. El otro tema que me intriga y que tengo la esperanza de que la conferencia de nuestro ponente de hoy me ayude a disipar esta duda es cómo conseguir que la comunidad internacional tenga suficiente poder para imponer la paz. Esto es algo que estos días echamos mucho de menos. O sea, ¿qué puede hacerse, qué pueden hacer los ciudadanos del mundo para algún día democráticamente podamos forzar a los gobiernos a imponer la paz cuando ésta sea tan necesaria como hoy, por ejemplo, en Gaza? Y luego tampoco me puedo resistir, voy a dedicar 2 minutos a ellos, si me permiten, hacer notar que hoy, 11 de marzo, es exactamente el 20 aniversario de un 11 de marzo de 2004 que fue terrible en nuestro país, que fue realmente el atentado más dramático que ha sufrido España desde siempre y del que pueden hacerse algunas lecturas. Y creo que es bueno, a la vez que conmemorarlo con todo el respeto que se merecen las personas que fueron víctimas del atentado, además con todo el interés por aprovechar, si me permite la expresión, las enseñanzas que puede pararnos. Entonces, yo creo que hay una enseñanza muy positiva y muy estimulante, que es que el atentado no produjo ningún tipo de fractura social en nuestro país. O sea, no hubo ni un solo incidente de islamofobia, podía haber ocurrido, no hubo ni un solo incidente. Hubo episodios en que musulmanes y cristianos estaban juntos por las víctimas. Me recordó lo que tuve la oportunidad, desgraciada, de ver en Boston el 20 de septiembre del 2001, cuando me impresionó y me emocionó hondamente ver físicamente obispos católicos y imams musulmanes rezando juntos por todos sus hermanos. Bien, esto es un indicador de que la sociedad española reacciona muy bien. También recuerdo con emoción cómo en Barcelona y en toda España nos sentíamos hermanados con Madrid. Es decir, yo creo que es una de las veces en la historia que más próximos y más unidos nos hemos sentido a nuestros hermanos madrileños. Bien, esta es la parte positiva de la lectura que se puede hacer del 11M. Luego hay lecturas no tan positivas que sí produjo fractura política, no fractura social, pero sí fractura política. Hay quien sitúa, algunos ensayistas sitúan en esa fecha el invento de las fake news, aquellas que llevan a considerar la verdad como creencia. Eso hace que haya miles de personas en España, aunque parezca sorprendente, que todavía creen que aquello de marzo del 2004 fue obra de ETA. Bueno, hay personas que lo creen porque porque la verdad es lo que ellos creen. Como ellos creen que fue obra de ETA, poco importan los hechos, lo que importa es la creencia. Bien, el invento de las fake news en nuestro país a gran escala, creo que se pueden datar en aquella época, y también se puede datar en aquella época un nivel, yo diría que insoportable como demócrata, de polarización política que lleva a desconsiderar al adversario, al que conviertes en enemigo. Esto, o corre el riesgo de convertir en enemigo. Esto, creo, es una de las lecturas, una de las consecuencias negativas de aquellos hechos, y si lo rememoro hoy es por respeto a la fecha solemne del 20 aniversario y por explicitar la esperanza de que nunca más vuelva a ocurrir el que nos polaricemos de esta manera ante una tragedia parecida, y que además seamos capaces, ya de ahí la sensatez de la madurez democrática que la sociedad española mostró en aquel momento y ha mostrado en diferentes momentos a lo largo de los últimos 40 años, por poner un periodo abastable que diríamos en esta tierra. Bien, no me alargo más y le cedo gustosamente la palabra al honorable señor cónsul de Bélgica. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, señor presidente, dear colleagues, señores y señoras, estimados amigos. És un plaer estar avui amb vosaltres en aquesta segunda conferència de Europa Talks, el cicle de conferències organitzats en el marc de la presidència belga de la Unión. Aprovecho la oportunidad para agradecer a nuestros socios, la Fundación La Caixa, la delegación de la Comisión de la Unión en Barcelona y también la oficina del Club de Roma en Barcelona y CIDOB. El ponente de hoy, el señor Marc Freeman, es muy conocido en Cataluña. Es fundador y director ejecutivo del Instituto de Transiciones Integradas con sede en Barcelona. Antes de ocupar su puesto actual, el señor Freeman trabajó para el International Crisis Group con sede en Bruselas, en Bélgica. Y también ayudó a lanzar el Centro Internacional para la Justicia Transicional. Como destacado experto en transición política y negociaciones de paz de alto nivel, se le consulta regularmente para obtener asesoramiento sobre gestión de crisis y reducción de conflictos. No hace falta de decir que su experiencia es y seguirá siendo muy valiosa ahora y en el futuro cercano. De hecho, las guerras en Ucrania, Etiopía, Sudán, el Sahel, Haití, Myanmar y Armenia son solo la parte más visible de los conflictos que están haciendo estragos y están aumentando en todo el mundo. Las estadísticas del International Crisis Group muestran que desde 2012 la guerra va en aumento. Mueren más personas en combates que en decenas. Cada vez son más los líderes que persiguen sus fines militares y creen que pueden salirse con la suya. ¿Cómo podemos salir de esta espiral negativa? ¿Cómo podemos silenciar las armas? ¿Cómo podemos construir la paz? Pero también, ¿cómo podemos hacer justicia? Marc Freeman ha trabajado en países como Ucrania, Venezuela, Colombia, Afganistán, Bolivia, Bosnia, Burundi, la República Democrática de Congo, Gambia, El Salvador, Kenia, Mauritania, Marruecos, Nepal, Serbia, Sri Lanka, Siria, Túnez, Turquía y Zimbabue. Lugares que a menudo son más conocidos por los conflictos que sufren que por su atractivo turístico. El señor Freeman contribuyó a que algunos de los lugares mencionando se alejen de la guerra y de los conflictos violentos y que vuelvan a descubrir por su cultura, naturaleza, gastronomía o patrimonio histórico. Además, Marc ha publicado libros basados en su experiencia en la negociación de la justicia transicional, el derecho internacional, los derechos humanos, la amnistía, las comisiones de verdad y de reconciliación y la búsqueda de la justicia. En resumidas cuentas, cuando pensamos en los conflictos violentos actuales y en cómo ponerles fin, el señor Freeman tiene mucho que enseñarnos. Sin más preámbulos, cedo la palabra al señor Paul Vargas, investigador senior de CIDOB y moderador de esta conferencia. Gracias por vuestra presencia.
Muchas gracias, Consul, por la invitación. I am Paul Vargas, Senior Researcher at CIDOB, and it is a pleasure to moderate this session. The title of the session is Argumentos a favor de un nuevo derecho internacional para la paz. Our speaker is Mark Freeman, founder and director of IFIT, Instituto para las Transiciones Integrales. Only to add that it has turned 10, is the 10th anniversary of this organization that has done so much work on peace, conflict resolution, and transitional justice. The talk today is particularly important because of the context that we live in. The famous peace scholar Roger McGuinty wrote recently that it is very, very difficult today to speak about peace because of the context, which is highly polarized. There is an increasing militarization. Everyone talks about security and defense. There is increasing contestation, rivalry among great powers, competition for resources. The challenge, I would add, is not only to talk about peace, to imagine peace, but also to think how international law could protect or facilitate peace. I think this is the challenge. Mark Freeman will talk for about 30-35 minutes. Then we'll have a Q&A in which you have the chance to ask or make reflections. Without further ado, Mark, thank you for being here. The floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you very much, and a special thank you to the Consul General and the Belgian Presidency of the Council of the EU for the invitation, and to all of the other organizers. I'm going to be a bit provocative this evening, partly because I think there's a tendency sometimes to think that peace is so obvious, why don't we have it? When, at least from my own work, peace is often a very remote possibility because it requires taking very bold risks. Some people risk their lives, some people risk their reputations. And so I want to provoke a little bit this evening, and I'm going to focus on a specific idea which has been coming into view for me, and I think will increasingly come into view for many people who do the work of peace in their societies or globally. And it has to do actually with a problem in relation to my day-to-day work. I'm actually part of the problem. A big part of the work that my organization does and that I've been doing for decades now involves negotiation. Negotiation is an instrument. Negotiation you can think of as a general category. It includes ideas like dialogue. It can include mediation, where a third party is involved. I'm going to talk about negotiation in that broad sense. And what I want to present to you this evening is the idea that negotiation, this instrument upon which very often peace depends, this field of negotiation is in crisis. I'm part of the problem, as I said. And I think it's in crisis at the very worst time. Already in the preliminary remarks, there were different concerns that were raised about these times. The way I think about it is we need negotiation more than ever, in part because the way that conflict occurs today, the causes or the drivers of conflict are far more complex. Even thinking about the kinds of wars that exist today. It can be anything from climate wars to cyber wars to gang wars. And often within specific territories, there are so many non-state armed groups acting, some of which have political motives, others don't, and where the state is often weak. A lot of the places that I've done work, the state is weak. It's getting harder to prevent and to resolve conflicts. And why I'm very concerned, but why I'm going to present two sort of ideas about what can be done. Why I'm very concerned is that we need an effective model of negotiation more than ever before. But as I said, this work of negotiation, this field of negotiation, is in crisis. So why it's in crisis, there's two reasons, and I'm going to talk about both of these this evening. The first reason that it's in crisis has to do with, I would say, an external variable, an external threat. And that threat actually is related to what would otherwise be something we would celebrate, which is advances in international law, in international human rights law, in international criminal law, in international humanitarian law. But negotiation doesn't have a law of its own. We depend on negotiation. Probably many of you in this audience have yourselves been part of the work of peace in this society or in other societies. But surprisingly, there is no international law for negotiation, purpose-built to make negotiation easier and less risky. As I said at the beginning, you need to help the people who will take the risks to achieve peace. It's not easy. It's not easy. It doesn't come cheaply. There's a very high price to be paid if you actually want peace. So if international law has nothing to help the negotiators of this world, that should concern us. But I said that the threat it's not so much that we don't have the international law. Lots of other areas of international law have grown up. I've been part of the building of some of those areas of law, which we celebrate. But they've actually encroached upon the room of maneuver of the negotiators. So that's why I call it a threat from the outside. So that's the first thing that I'm going to talk about. That's one part of why negotiation is in crisis today. It has to do with good things that have happened, but that haven't been accompanied by protective measures, if you like, for the negotiators of this world. So that's the international law part. And there's a second part. I think I'm going to have to get some water, sorry. So there's a second part, a second threat, which actually comes from within. So, and I said I'm part of the problem. It's that today there's a problem that's almost hiding in plain sight, which is that today when we think about negotiation, those of us who do this work, there's only one model that is considered legitimate and effective. And it's been something that, again, I have helped to construct. I've been part of that process, and I'm proud of that work. I've been involved in lots of different negotiations. But there's only one paradigm of the correct way to negotiate today. The problem isn't just that there's only one form of legitimate and effective negotiation. The problem, actually, is that the model we have is slow. It's very slow. So whereas we have all kinds of new and complex forms of conflict, such as the ones that I mentioned, the deterioration of those conflicts is ever quicker. We have a slow model of negotiation. We only have one. We only have one way that we think is the correct way to negotiate, and that model is slow. And that's an internal threat to peace. So we have an external gap or threat, and we have an internal one. Those are the two things that I'm going to speak about this evening. So my wife is here, so she's guiding me to something. There's a table. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. So, very important. So let's start with the outside threat. As I said, we have an international law that covers almost every sphere of human activity, almost everything we do. But there's no international law that's purpose-built for peacemaking. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There's actually one sentence in the UN Charter, one sentence that refers to the use of negotiation, conciliation, and mediation. There's one sentence There's no body of international law of and for peacemaking. And that would be well and fine, except for the fact that we've had, as I mentioned earlier, extraordinary advances in lots of areas of international law, which we celebrate, but which would have had an encroachment effect on the space for negotiation. So I'm going to explain in a moment how that works, but I do also just want, for those who are not international lawyers, you may imagine that the world is on a trajectory towards, it's sort of like a process of revelation, of self-revelation, where there's an international law that's perfect that we're gradually discovering and moving towards. And eventually we'll reach this perfect form of international law. I would argue international law is nothing like that. It's been created at critical junctures of history when there are conditions that allow, but sometimes it's a shock of the conscience. I mean, international human rights law emerged in the shadow of the Holocaust, in the shadow of the Shoah. It was a shock to the conscience, and there was an awareness that we need a body of international law that will ensure minimal human rights. That wasn't a concept that really existed per se before that. But even international humanitarian law, which is the laws of war, that came about a century earlier. And again, it was very specific critical junctures when often it could be me, it could be any of you, someone realizes that there's a gap in international law, a problem that needs to be fixed, and it's introduced. It's basically an incremental process, but we're not actually on a linear path where eventually we're going to reach the promised land of international law. And when we do this process, because it's piecemeal, because it's incremental, sometimes problems arise. Even as we're moving in seemingly a very good direction and we're filling gaps in international law, if we're not careful, if we're not paying attention, sometimes we're creating a problem by building one area of international law, we're creating a problem in some other area. And that is exactly what has happened, in part, to negotiation. We haven't built an international law of negotiation, but those of us doing this work, year after year, have become progressively aware of the shrinking of the space that we have to do this risk-taking work, to make difficult choices. I'm myself not a negotiator, I advise negotiators, but it's in the very nature of negotiation that there are mutual concessions. A negotiation is not a process in which one side imposes its will on the other. So you need flexibility. You absolutely need flexibility, or really shouldn't be negotiating. You should use something else. Negotiation is when essentially there's a process through which an agreement will be reached involving quid pro quos. International law didn't really matter for a very long period, actually. Before the Cold War, the work of negotiators was often seen purely through a political lens. You didn't really think about the international law dimension of what you were agreeing. Could you reach an agreement? Could you achieve a political settlement? Could you achieve a peace deal? If you could, that was it. That was good enough. That was good enough. That changed, and it's become, it's almost unimaginable to think about peace talks today without saying, and what about international law? And when we say, and what about international law? Mostly we're thinking about international human rights law, international criminal law, and the laws of war, or what's called international humanitarian law. And again, as I mentioned those three areas, you're probably thinking, well, those sound great. Who doesn't want international human rights law? Who doesn't want international criminal law? Who doesn't want international humanitarian law? The problem for negotiation is that those bodies of international law today have affected what the parties themselves, the negotiators, the mediators, believe is possible. It is, as I said, it's an encroachment effect. It's a shrinking of the space to make these hard deals. A lot of the work that I've done over the years has been focused on how to deal with questions of injustice, the victims of these different kinds of conflict. What is their place in a negotiation? We're only asking those questions in part because of the elevation and the growth of these areas important as they are, of international human rights law, international criminal law, and international humanitarian law. But they've also made it harder. They've made it harder, and that's just a reality that we have. Because we haven't accompanied or matched those areas with something that protects the need that negotiators have for flexibility. This is a really critical thing. Again, it's in the nature of negotiation that there's a quid pro quo. There are mutual concessions. There's no negotiation without mutual concessions. Again, in a perfect world, an international law of negotiation would exist. So one of the things that my organization has been doing over the last several years is to build an international law of negotiation, in part to give a little bit of breathing space to the risk takers, to the people who are going to have to make hard choices, make difficult choices, and do so while aware of international law. But unless we have something built for negotiators, we're going to constantly be in this situation where people will say, well, that's a nice peace deal, but who's going to jail? That's a question that people ask all the time today. You didn't ask that question 30 years ago. People want to know who's going to jail and when. You could probably imagine that's a pretty hard issue to deal with in a negotiation. It's pretty hard to convince someone to agree to a deal, to lay down their arms or to stop fighting, in order to basically walk into a jail cell. That's pretty hard, but that's the expectation that's kind of grown up through all of these developments, again, which are worth celebrating. So I'll let you think about that for a second while I drink some more. So that's again, that's a general point, but it has to do with, as I said, something that is threatened or I would say harmed negotiation inadvertently. And it's not something from within the field. It came, so to speak, from outside. But we've all been part of that. Let me switch to a slightly different point. And as I said, the threat isn't only from the outside. It also has to do with this idea that we have one model that is developed of negotiation, one paradigm, one correct way to negotiate. And the model that we have is slow, very slow. Why is it slow? Well, it's slow in part because of what I was saying a moment ago. We have a model of negotiation that's slow because the very act or pursuit of negotiation has become infused with the same ideals that inform international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law, which is the ideas having to do with things like participation. Victims should participate in these processes. Again, it's a great point. It's an important point. It used to be that peace deals and political settlements were reached and they were done behind closed doors by the elites, and everyone would complain afterward. Well, I shouldn't say everyone. Lots of people didn't complain, but some complained. And rightly so. They said, well, where are we in this process? We don't see ourselves here. And what's happened, again, it's sort of, as I said earlier, it's sort of a problem in plain sight. It's hidden in plain sight, this issue. We've built a model that has been infused with all of these beautiful ideals to the point where it's become as much based on idealism as pragmatism or realism. Notwithstanding the fact that at the end of the day, negotiation is a very operational thing. It's very practical, it's very pragmatic, and it requires that again because intrinsically, mutual concessions, quid pro quos, that is what you are getting when you choose the path of negotiation. And so we have a slow model. So I'm going to explain a little bit what this slow model looks like. And if any of you have taken courses on negotiation, on peacemaking, you would have received probably the same information, no matter who is teaching it, in terms of what is the correct way to negotiate. And it's one, as I said, that many of us who do this work, we've been part of building this model. So what makes it slow? Well, I've mentioned it already, I've hinted at already at one example. The expectation today is that there will be a lot of very, let's say, inclusive participation in a process of negotiation. It's no longer an elite deal. Lots of different actors will be involved and should be involved, need to be at the table, need to be consulted. a very important principle, but it adds to this, it slows things down. The more the participation, all else being equal, the slower you're moving. What about the agenda? Well, the agenda is very similar. The idea in negotiation today, again, if you're taking a course, if you were learning about it, or if you're reading the different guidelines of different institutions, it would say the agenda has to be broad. It has to include everything from the root causes all the way to the most extreme consequences of whatever form of conflict there is. Again, very important that there should be a comprehensive agenda. It's an important idea, but it slows you down. Another principle that you would learn has to do with actually the very nature of the relationship between the adversaries in a negotiation room. If any of you have been in a negotiation room, you'll know what I'm talking about, which is the idea that the two sides, if there's two, should over time, through the process of negotiation itself, there should be a transformation in their relationship from confrontation to cooperation. That's a kind of logic embedded into the correct way of negotiating. Again, very important principle, slow. Another example, today, if there are facilitators or mediators in a negotiation for peace or for a political settlement, if there are facilitators and mediators, meaning third parties who are trying to guide things, the model, the correct way for them to approach it is to be very hands-off. Wait to be asked or wait to be called upon, and then do something. Again, it's a laudable principle. You could probably imagine why that's a good idea, but again, it makes things slower. There's a very long list of examples of this sort. And again, I can touch upon some of those in the question and answer period. But in the way that we think about this work in our organization, we've got 11 of these different principles. Principles of the correct way to negotiate, this critical instrument. But again, adding those all up, you get slow negotiation. Now, why this is a problem, just to go back to something I said at the beginning, is that everyone who does this work says the urgency is greater than ever. The urgency for solving these situations is greater than ever. The complexity of the conflicts is greater than ever. The speed at which they deteriorate is greater than ever. So when we look into our toolbox and we find only one instrument and it's slow, that's a problem. And that's why I said at the very beginning, we're actually in crisis. It's a crisis that I think will become more and more obvious over time. It's almost a form of cognitive dissonance. We're aware of it. We know something's wrong. We're trying to figure out what is wrong here. That is what's wrong. Urgency on the one hand, slow tool on the other. It's cognitive dissonance, which is why one of the newer projects of my organization is something we call fast-track negotiation. Fast-track negotiation. This idea, fast-track negotiation, there's no model of fast-track negotiation today, but we need it more than ever because of the cyber wars, the climate wars, the gang wars, and everything in between. We need it. We don't have it. And so that's a very important new initiative of our organization, which is, again, related to this larger crisis that I'm talking about. So fast-track negotiation, how would that work? How would that work? What would fast-track negotiation look like? Well, I'll just, again, maybe draw on the different examples I gave that are part of the set of principles that inform the slow model that we have, what I often call Model A. That's the model we have. In a fast-track model, what would participation look like? Well, it wouldn't be broad participation. It would be what I call inclusive enough participation. Inclusive enough. Inclusive enough to get to a deal. That is actually the reason you're negotiating. That is actually the reason you're negotiating, is to get to a deal. A deal that can be implemented, but to get to a deal. So that would be a contrasting principle in a fast-track model. What about the agenda? What about the agenda? Well, in Model A, the model that we have, the correct way to negotiate, that again is a correct way when time is on your side, which it almost never is. But when time is on your side, you have the slow model. We all have it. We all use it. But for most situations, we need a fast-track model. So whereas in the existing paradigm of how to negotiate, the agenda is very broad, should cover, as I said, everything from root causes to the most extreme consequences of whatever conflict situation you're facing. In the logic of fast track, it would be a much tighter agenda. It might only be one item. It might only be one item. Maybe a ceasefire. Maybe a political settlement that allows slightly more competitive elections. In the imperfect world that we do most of our work in, that can be a pretty decent outcome. It's a faster outcome. It may be limited, but it's faster, and it is an actual outcome. And so that may put some people, in discomfort. I mean, these are ideas that I'm sharing where people say, well, no, I much prefer to have everybody involved in a very broad agenda. Great, when time is on your side. Most of the time it isn't. In most cases, time is very short and we need a fast-track model. So again, it would follow different principles. What about the relationship between the adversaries? As I said, in the classic existing paradigm of the correct way to negotiate, the adversaries are trying to transform their relationship into one of cooperation and away from confrontation. It's a beautiful ideal, but in a fast-track model, the logic is much more transactional. Again, probably not a very comfortable idea to think about, but in most cases, when urgency is a reality, it's not just rhetorical, it's an actual reality. There's an urgent need to prevent or solve a political or an armed conflict. Speed matters massively. And so transactional logics would be more typical of a fast-track model than in the existing paradigm that we have, which again is based on important ideals, but ones which in aggregate produce slow negotiation, and thus this mismatch that I'm talking about, right? So again, these are things that, the things that I'm describing, I've been part of. I really want to be clear. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody here. If I was going to point it anywhere, I could point it at myself. This is a field, these are issues that have developed over time. As I said, we had, in the case of what I'm mostly talking about here, was the critical juncture, was the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, there was a very important period of multilateral cooperation that emerged. There were a lot of civil wars as well, but there was it was a very dynamic period, let's say, the years following the end of the Cold War. So we started doing a lot of things because we thought maybe we were living in an era where we would somehow get on the other side of conflict, on the other side of war. We could get there. But here we are in 2024, and some of the statistics were mentioned already by the Consul General, but we couldn't be further in some ways from that reality. Meaning, again, to go back to what I said at the beginning, negotiation, the people who do this work, we are in a state of crisis at the very worst moment. At the very worst moment. Because of what we haven't built, we have not built an international law of negotiation. That's, again, something that our organization is working on. We've actually developed a whole draft treaty to try and think about what an international law of negotiation would look like. We need that. But in addition, we now are in a situation where we have this greater and greater awareness of the urgency and the complexity of conflicts that we're facing. We know we have to move very quickly, and all we have is one model of what's considered legitimate and effective negotiation, and that model is slow, very slow. For good reasons, but it's slow. And so those are basically some provocations. I think I promised at the beginning I would try and provoke a bit, but I think indeed, I'm not saying that to be cute or funny. I do think that the work of negotiation is in crisis. When again, maybe some of you in this audience as well have either yourself or know people who have who've done this kind of work. And if you speak with negotiators about international law, they'll often say, they'll kind of roll their eyes and say, it's just, I mean, it's literally another hurdle. It's another obstacle in a process that's already improbable. Negotiation to get to an outcome is improbable. Most negotiations fail. They fail spectacularly. Many negotiations never even arise because the parties themselves are afraid to even start negotiating. And then we have international law, and they look and they say, oh my God, what a headache. International law is honestly perceived as another obstacle or hurdle to the risk takers who want to actually bring some form of peace to their societies. And they look at international law, and all they see is obstacles and hurdles. That doesn't need to be like that, but that is how it is today. So we do need an international law of negotiation. And then the other point that I've already made, again, you talk about the negotiation model we have. We're all working with it. And when I have had conversations over just even the last few weeks with some of my friends who do this work at a very high level, negotiators, people in our own organization, you talk about the idea of if I even just mention the idea, what about a fast track model? They say, please tell me more. Why do they want to know more? Because we're in crisis. There are no results almost coming, there are very few results coming these days from the one model of legitimate and effective negotiation that we have, the one paradigm that we have, because it is slow. And so it's critical that we also have not just this important, valid, but slow model, but we also need one that I call a fast track model of negotiation for the vast majority of situations which have actual urgency. We need to overcome this mismatch between the urgency of the situations and the slowness of the instrument that we have. So I hope I've provoked enough. I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, truly provocative. Now I would like to open the floor to the audience. While the audience think about the first question or suggestion or reflection, let me add that one question I had in my mind, and later you can. We have been learning, perhaps since the 1990s, that peace is slow, that peace needs time, that peace needs to be sustained, needs to be inclusive, the more the better. So in a sense, your model is a provocation to our understanding of peace. So could you redefine our understanding of the ideal of peace in this talk? But let's open up to the audience, and let's perhaps collect 2, 3, 4 questions. I see one question there. Could you please introduce yourselves and ask a question?
My name is Borja Palladini. I have a short reflection about your model, which I like a lot. My question and my concern is, one of the key reasons that explain that the negotiations are slow is that the parties do not trust each other. They don't, and part of the process is to create the political space for trust building. And this is a very slow process, and it's a very fragile and weak process, and it's prone to collapse like that. And my question is, how do you think, or what can you think about trust building? How do you imagine trust building in this process of fast track negotiations? And the second question, if you allow me, is how do you imagine a fast track implementation? Because another key question in the negotiations is that the parties do not trust each other about implementation. They don't believe that the other is going to commit to what they agree upon. Then, and part of the successful of the negotiations and the agreements and political settlements is to be able to implement as soon as possible to gain momentum and to build trust about the possibility of producing changes. How do you think about fast-track implementation?
Thank you. Let's collect another speaker.
Or one more, and then I can.
Yes, and then you problem. Can. Yeah. One more.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jonas Freeman. I'm an undergraduate student at Harvard University. And I wanted to ask about the treaty, because one of the things I think from my Gen Z perspective is that I've sort of been taught to view new laws as an obstacle and government as an obstacle for sort of, let's say, freedom of the individual. And so one of the concerns that I had immediately was how are we going to ensure that a new treaty for negotiators isn't just another obstacle for the negotiators and they view it as something which limits their capacity. So how are you thinking about that in your treaty?
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll do them in reverse order then maybe. So when you think about international human rights law or the laws of war or international criminal law, those are the three areas that I mentioned. Probably everyone here would say those are good things. It's good we have those areas of law. All of those are based on a logic in the way each of the treaties is designed that is focused on state accountability. And in some cases, individual accountability when we're talking about grave breaches of the laws of war and things like that. There is an accountability focus. That's why we have these, holding some actors accountable. The international law of negotiation does not use that logic. It is focused on incentives for negotiation, for reaching settlements. It is not focused on holding anybody accountable because it is focused on, the goal is to expand the space, to give a bit more flexibility back to negotiators. So it wouldn't make sense in that regard. So even in the question, I think there is a default often in different people's minds about the structure, the kind of governing dynamic of how is international law built. Because most of it, the default is that most times it's focused on holding somebody accountable for implementing something of international law. But we do have some areas, some of them are related to trade, and some of them are related to climate issues, where international law does not have the logic of holding accountable. It has the logic of giving incentives that encourage certain kinds of action or giving flexibility. That is the logic of the international treaty for peace negotiation that we're building. So in that sense, it's precisely to overcome that encroachment effect that I was describing from these otherwise desirable and laudable areas of international law that hold actors accountable as we would want them to, but if we haven't matched that with anything to protect the negotiators or to incentivize the negotiators. So all they've experienced is loss. All they've experienced is loss. That's really, I'm maybe overstating it, but the main feeling is we now have a whole new set of hurdles and obstacles on top of the ones that we already had. It's in a sense, it's a lifting of some of that. That's the goal and the logic in the way that we've designed this draft treaty. Then, Borja, in terms of your question, so thank you. So I suppose, and maybe I'll connect these questions slightly because there are, let's say, some macro goals that have to inform a fast track model. And if I was to, so this is maybe a bit more related to your question, so I'll come to Borja's, but the model of negotiation that we have, this paradigm, the one that any of us would be taught in a university or in a training course, or the one you would find in every multilateral organization if you looked at their guidelines, what is the correct way to negotiate? It is based on, it's partly based on practice, but it's also based on a lot of ideals. It's based on a lot of ideals. That sounds good. That's also a problem. Sounds good. It's also a problem. And so if I was to say, well, what is the logic of how do we think about peace if we're saying, well, it's going to follow fast track principles. It's built for speed, not slowness. It's built on the premise that time is short, not on the premise that time is on our side. Again, we have to have a different set of principles. And the way that I think about it, some of you may know this famous distinction by someone who recently passed named Johann Galtung, who made this famous contrast between what he called negative peace and positive peace. So the idea is that negative peace is essentially the absence of violence. Not much more, but it's the absence of violence. Positive peace is kumbaya. All human rights are perfectly implemented. There's total equity in society. We have everything we want. This is a paradise on earth. That's positive peace. The model we have of negotiation, which again, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. I can certainly point it first at myself, is based on a logic, on a set of goals of positive peace. A fast-track model is not based on the premise that positive peace is the goal. Rather, it's based on the idea of negative peace, the absence of violence. Whatever else may come, it has to come through other processes. It can involve 10 different negotiations, simultaneous, consecutive, or just one. It is a different bar. It is based less on ideals, more on realism. It is based less on what we hopefully will achieve in a beautiful long term versus what we must achieve in an immediate short term. And so the outcomes are real, but they're necessarily more limited because it has a logic of negative peace, the absence of violence, versus a logic of positive peace. So in that sense, in terms of your question, Borja, how do we think about the transformation? We don't really think about it that much in a fast-track model. The goal is to get some real, tangible outcomes now because people need it, because the situation is actually urgent. And maybe, again, to take a different distinction, we often, in the dominant model of negotiation, we say our goal is to end the conflict. End it. End it. End it. But in a fast-track model, you might be thinking about the macro goal is situated differently. It's more, there's a very good Israeli academic named Mika Goodman who talks about shrinking the conflict as a path to eventually end it. But you first have to shrink it. You're trying to reshape the conflict. That's the goal of a fast track, to start reducing the conflict, reshaping the conflict, shrinking the conflict. Because, again, we have to be consistent. As I say, there has to be a match. We can't say, and Borja, you and I both have worked a lot on the Colombian peace process. Again, we have to find a better match between the goals and the tools, as I said. The goals sometimes and the needs are urgent. We can't then have a slow model, but that is our situation, right? And we have to have a better balance between the ideals and the real practical needs. And we all know. So transformation doesn't really come into view except maybe through multiple fast-track efforts. You're not trying to end the conflict. You want it to end, of course you do, but that's not actually the way you're using a fast-track model because it wouldn't make sense. And in that sense, implementation, people will say, well, if it's just a limited agreement that you achieved and you didn't really include as many people as the slow model, the one that we're taught, the correct way to negotiate, and the agenda is very limited, and it's just this little short agreement as opposed to this, multi-volume agreement, and et cetera, et cetera. And so you might say, well, then how is this sustainable? I mean, it's just this limited ceasefire in this local area. Or, as I said, it could be a political settlement that allows for a slightly more competitive election. You say, what's the point of that? I mean, it's just so little, right? I would say, and then they say, well, is it really sustainable? That people would say, well, if you have a limited ceasefire, is that sustainable? At least there's something to sustain. There's something to sustain because there is actually an agreement. There's actually an agreement. What is there to sustain in a slow model that doesn't produce an agreement? There's nothing to sustain.
More. There's one question there. Second round. Let's ask 3 questions and then back to you.
Mark, thank you so much for a thought-provoking presentation. My name is Musa Kika, and I work with Mark at IFIT. I have 2 questions, which are quite related to the questions that the young freemen they asked. The first has to do with the times we are in. We are in what have been described as the age of conflicts, and there are a couple of things happening. Number one is the drop in the normative value of international law, its respectability. Regulation as well is being challenged as a way of sustaining justice and peace. So in that space, should we be driving more towards the regulation in the sense of creating another set of international law for purposes of incentivizing, even if we call it incentivizing, peace negotiation? Part of what has been raised in the age of conflicts is that institutions may not survive the age of conflicts that we are in, but the values will. So should we not be thinking, instead of creating another institution of international law, should we not be thinking of a way of institutionalizing the values of negotiation from a futures thinking perspective? Number two, my second question has to do with, we spoke about the fast track model, which you have sold us quite well. It does seem to me to move in the opposite direction of creating an international law for peace, right? Why? You said the current model is based on an ideal or ideals, but the second model, fast track, is more practical, it's more pragmatic. That seems to me to be moving towards deregulation as opposed to regulation. So is there no cognitive dissonance there in the two approaches? When we are moving in a fast track way, we are actually, doing away with the obligations which may be obstacles. Even a law that incentivizes does create obligations. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Hi, my name is Caroline Köhl. I'm from the German consulate here in Barcelona. And I would just be interested, how would your perfect plan be for implementing that international law? And who are you targeting? Are you targeting international organizations, like for example, the European Union or the United Nations, or are you more targeting the individual governments?
Thank you. When you were speaking about the fast-track negotiations and the more transactional aspect of it, I was thinking about Venezuela. We've seen in the past a few examples where there was a play with sanctions or lifting sanctions or not sanctions, all with the idea to facilitate upcoming elections or the participation. Now, it doesn't seem to go very far. And I was wondering how could you give examples of maybe other negotiations where fast track has been used maybe with more success, or where eventually, based on small successes, bigger successes could be aimed for as a kind of a way forward? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, we have 3 questions.
Yeah. So maybe just a few distinctions. Maybe I'll touch upon all 3 questions, but maybe not quite in the exact order. I suppose the first thing to say is that when I talk about a fast track model, I want to emphasize the word model. Why? There are lots of examples, probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands of examples of fast negotiations. Negotiations that have gone quickly. Scores and scores across history. What we don't have is a fast track model. And I make that distinction because right now when we say negotiation, someone says, let's negotiate, or there should be a negotiation, our mind immediately goes to the one paradigm we have. Which again, when you add up all of its very important principles, produces slow negotiation. But that is the only default we have when we think about how to do this. And so sometimes when I've raised this question about a fast track model, people say, well, where is it? Well, that has to actually be built. That's one of our main projects this year in our organization, is to build a fast track model, informed by the many examples of negotiations that have been quick. The negotiations that have been quick, you mentioned Venezuela. For the most part, so our organization has been doing work toward a negotiated solution for 7 years now, mostly following the one paradigm that we have. And there have already been 4 different negotiations over that time, each with a different facilitator, but mostly we've been following the paradigm. But when we look back even in Venezuela's history, and people say, what was an example in our own history in Venezuela of negotiations that worked, that produced an outcome? Mostly we're talking about fast examples. So one of them was this famous accord called Punto Fijo, which was negotiated by elites behind closed doors, produced a political settlement that most Venezuelans today would say, that was a good example. Doesn't follow anything to do with the paradigm. It actually would violate every principle of the paradigm. But it produced an outcome, and that outcome generally worked. So when going around thinking about, people say, as I said, they say, well, how would the model work? We're building the model right now and doing the research right now. But at the end of the day, we can't just list off a bunch of examples. There actually has to be a fast track model, so that we are not limited to only one model of what is considered the correct way to negotiate, especially when that model is slow, very slow. So we're building that model. So that's just in a sense, and even, I mean, I'll just make it even more, I can make it personal as well, in the sense that thinking back to our work last year, I remember, as many of you will also remember, in April of last year, that a war broke out in Sudan. It was obvious to absolutely everybody that this war was going to deteriorate. I mean, it was moving so fast, and it was so deadly, and it was just horrendous to watch. And so again, what was the reflex of all the different actors? Well, go into our toolbox of how to negotiate, and there's really one that is, we have this one model, and it is slow, notwithstanding what we could see with our own eyes. And I remember, for example, the USA and Saudi Arabia were among the different countries that mobilized quickly to try and stem the tide, to stop this war from entrenching, which it has done. And it did so very quickly. And I remember the criticisms when they actually managed to reach a very early but very limited deal, saying, well, this is illegitimate. I mean, you look at the model, this doesn't follow the model. Where are all the participants? Where's the broad agenda? Where's the root causes? Where's the transfer? And meanwhile, this country was, I mean, you can't say it's falling apart. It's being destroyed by 2 armies fighting each other and fighting against their own people. This is just how it is. Time is short. And so we need a fast-track model so that when these situations, and they're going to not only continue to arise, they'll be, again, ever more complex, with ever more actors, and ever more kinds of diverse arsenal that are being used. I mean, again, I mentioned cyber wars earlier. We need a model of negotiation premised on the idea and the reality, in most cases, that time is short. So we're building the model. All we have now is a bunch of examples, but with no order to them, and certainly with no legitimacy. And that's what has to be built there. In terms of the peace treaty initiative, there were different questions about that. So I mean, the short practical question that was also about, who is this treaty for? Who would sign it? So again, for the non-lawyers or the non-international lawyers in the room, international law only exists when states, in the system that we have, UN member states, sign or ratify or accede to the treaty. It doesn't exist under any other circumstances. It can't be, there are parts of international law that courts deal with or other institutes, but at the end of the day, something only becomes international law when at least treaty law in particular, when states sign or ratify or exceed it. So the targets at the end for this treaty must be, because of the way international law is built, or what's called public international law is built, we have to have states sign it. And so we've been basically in a process of diplomatic engagement over the past number of years, and also technical engagement to try to improve the text of the treaty. We've had, I don't know how many, over 100 events at least, with negotiators around the world, international lawyers, diplomats. And so at the end of June of this year, there'll be a final draft that will be presented, and it will be presented to all states, all UN member states. And then there'll be a diplomatic engagement process focused just on them. And at the end, we'll see who are the early adopters of it. But essentially, we've been in a very gradual engagement process that will move to its final stage as of July 1st of this year. And then, Musa, your questions as well, in terms of, in particular, I suppose, this coherence that may be perceived as incoherence between wanting to have a treaty that incentivizes incentivizes recourse to negotiation, and any perception that the fast track model may seem to contradict that. So one of the things that we have an advisory group for our what we call the Peace Treaty Initiative, to create this initiative to create a treaty for negotiation, purpose-built for negotiation. One of the things that we'll be talking about with our expert advisor group, which is mostly made up of some very prominent peace negotiators around the world, is a fast-track clause in that treaty. Because I think we do need to sort of make those two things mesh. The way that we built the treaty in the first instance is probably, if you read it today, it would probably look a lot like what I call Model A. It will match the paradigm of negotiation that I'm describing as slow, because it is slow when you add up all of its elements. And you would find that well reflected in the way that this treaty is designed. But what we also want to do is to introduce a fast-track clause. It would indeed be incoherent or a contradiction to say on the one hand we need a fast-track model, and then to have a peace treaty text that looks like it's built for slow negotiation. Again, the point of a fast-track model is not to supplant or erase or eliminate the model that we have, but rather to expand the toolbox, because it is serious. It's seriously incoherent. As I said, it is a form of cognitive dissonance to be watching with our eyes the urgency, the unraveling of too many places. Think about Haiti today. Think about too many other places. War, the battlefield is everywhere now, and yet we only have a slow model of negotiation. That is very dangerous, but that is our reality.
Thank you. Let's open the third round of questions. One question there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marina Dan Marcos. I'm a research assistant at the Institute for Integrated Transitions. We've heard the word polarization mentioned several times today. It was even named Word of the Year in 2023 by Fundeorrae, the Foundation for Urgent Spanish. So I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on how polarization is affecting this international law of peace negotiation and the ongoing processes, and what the Institute is doing to address it.
Thank you. Let me add one question. In war, usually parties do not want to negotiate because they think that there can be gains in the battlefield. Therefore, they prefer to wait because negotiations implies, as you said, making a concession. So, how do you convince parties that they do not need to negotiate, but that they need to do it to reach an agreement fast? Your experience seems to say that, yes, parties are willing to reach an agreement fast. Could you elaborate, or could you give us some examples in which this was the case, rather than what we usually hear, for instance, in Ukraine and Russia, that no parties do not want to negotiate, let alone reach an agreement with the opponent.
Yeah. Okay, well, so I'll do the questions in reverse order then. So the fast track model, and let me contrast this again with the model that we have. We only have one model, which is slow. I call it Model A normally, but that is the model that we use. That is the model we built. That is the model that we have. It is not only the case that the model we have is based on some of those principles and practices that I've referred to already about who participates, what the agenda looks like, how to structure the agreement, etc. There are also other premises that it's built upon. And one of those is what you referred to, which is the idea that you only negotiate when the term we use in the field is when the situation is ripe. There's this concept of ripeness, madurez. The idea that you have to look for ripeness in order, and then only then do you negotiate. There's even a more extreme, but I think very helpful concept. This is not mine. It was just written by a famous scholar many years ago, which is the term called a mutually hurting stalemate. You only have a chance at a successful negotiation when there is a stalemate that is mutually hurting on the parties. Mutually hurting stalemate. MHS. I mean, people, this is how, technocratic some of these things get. And that's the premise. So you say, well, when do we negotiate? When we have those things. When it's right, the situation is right. In a fast track model, someone has to start. Someone can make the first gesture. We're offering to negotiate. You don't know what the other side necessarily thinks. And it can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be a diplomat. It doesn't have to be one of the armed groups. It can be a civic leader. It can be the mayor of a town. It can be any number of actors under what's called, in the fast track model, you would have what's called a multi-track logic. You can start negotiation anytime. Someone has to make the first offer, make the first step. And so, again, you might say, well, that doesn't sound very realistic. Well, someone actually has to make the first step. And the conditions in most of these situations, you'll never get to that perfect moment where, everything is taken shape exactly as we wanted. Both sides or all the sides agree the negotiated solution is the way. That's an optimal condition. It's very rare that it exists. So you have to work. This again, a fast track logic is just get started, just try and see where it goes. It doesn't guarantee you that you'll get there. It doesn't guarantee you that your counterpart will also see the benefit of negotiation. But sometimes, we know this from our research, we know that sometimes it's only when the option of negotiation is presented that a party says, oh, that's interesting. Until someone actually makes that step, there is no negotiation. And then it's just academics looking around saying, do we have ripeness? Do we have a mutually hurting stalemate? Someone actually has to take that step. And then they'll see what happens. It's a construction in that sense. But it has to start somewhere. And then in terms of polarization, the question from the audience, well, again, in our work, we actually have another very large initiative on polarization called the Global Initiative on Polarization, which is with the Ford Foundation. And we're halfway through it. It's a 4-year project. And we began that project actually because exactly of the connection between polarization and negotiation, or polarization and dialogue. And the simple idea is that, the way that we conceive of polarization, we call it a hyperproblem, meaning that it is the special category of problem that makes your ability to solve all other problems more difficult. It's not a problem, it's a hyper problem, right? It makes all other, again, it's a special category of problem. It makes your ability to solve anything else harder, more remote. So if you accept that concept, that's what polarization is. That's how it works. That's the kind of problem it is. I think it's an obvious sort of logical next step why that's not good for negotiation. You can't have, polarization is a situation, whether it's in a society or in a political system, in which you have radicalization between and within poles. So, your ability, if you have polarization like that at scale, and polarization it's not a small dispute between neighbors. It's something that occurs at scale between poles that are radicalized. It's a condition that obviously makes it much harder to negotiate. And that's why I say, part of our work, we couldn't do good work on negotiation unless we were also paying attention to polarization. That too would be incoherent. So we're doing a lot of work to understand it better. And our focus is of course on the solution side of that, but it is a pernicious problem for negotiation and everything else.
We need to finish at 7:30 sharp, but there is time for another round of questions and answers. This will be the last round, so don't be shy. Just ask. Cicle.
Hello, and thank you for creating this space for debate. My name is Laia, and I'm just introducing myself as a citizen who is concerned about all the conflicts that are happening today. And I have the feeling that what slows down the process is the will of the actors involved in a conflict to assume the obligations that or that commit to accept the obligations to limit their behavior. So in this fast track model, my question is, how do you create or how do you promote or how you contribute for the actors involved in conflicts to make this will happen? How if the will is not there, because today even sanctions, it seems sanctions or the public opinion is not enough sometimes for countries or the actors to stop or act. So how can or is it a way, or is there a way in your model to create this space for making the actors involved in the conflicts to commit to their obligations? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? This question reminds me to this week the Pope made this or said that both Ukrainians and Russians need the courage for the white flag, the courage for peace. Of course, these words didn't sit well in many circles, but let's highlight this word: courage. Courage for negotiations, courage for peace, courage for fast-track agreements. Is courage something missing in today's world? To add on that question.
I mean, I couldn't say whether it's missing more today than it has in the past. What I would say is that it is an illusion. It is an absolute illusion to imagine peace without very courageous people taking absolutely immense personal risks. Mm-hmm. That's just like believing in the tooth fairy. That doesn't happen. That does not happen. Again, as I say, peace isn't something where we sit down together and we try and understand each other and we come to see each other in a different light. And so there are definitely going to be people who are taking immense risks. Risks of life, risks of liberty, risks of reputation. And that's how peace happens. So as I say, I mean, part of the part of the logic, part of the rationale, a very important part of the rationale for having an international law for negotiation is precisely to make it a little bit less difficult than it is today for the people who will be taking those risks. Because without those people, there's nothing. There's just the illusion of peace. It won't happen. So I mean, I would say that's, we've done, as I said, I mean, I don't know how many different interviews and events and so forth talking about the ideas of this peace treaty. And we asked negotiators around the world in every peace process you can imagine, current ones, past ones, what allows you to succeed? What are the things that prevented you from succeeding? Absolutely the number one thing is taking risks. There are people who took risks that we have to honor and make it possible for them to do it. Or it's just an illusion. It's just an illusion. It won't happen. And in terms of, again, the idea of aligning, well, I want peace, but you don't want peace. Again, a model can't solve that situation on its own for you. But what a model can do is give you some ideas, some principles, some logic, something, some methodology to work with so you can think about what maybe a first step would look like. And a first step that doesn't match the perfect ideals that we've built into the one paradigm that we have that, but if we only have that, I mean, people won't take those risks. They won't see themselves as potential negotiators or the person or the actor that will take that first step because we don't have the perfect conditions. We can't produce this majestic form of negotiation based on all of these high-minded ideals, which are very important, which I believe in, which I've contributed to, but which are slow in practice. We can't limit ourselves to one paradigm that is slow. That's, again, if you leave with any thought, I would say, please leave with that thought, or that question at least in your mind. And then finally, the point about, again, will. Again, you can't, a model doesn't produce will, but a model might allow for the building of will precisely because it increases the willingness for actors to take risks. And in particular with a fast track model, which is based less on international actors coming in, but more on local agency, a sense that maybe I could start this negotiation. Maybe I don't have to wait for those perfect conditions, and I can't wait for those conditions. I'm going to take a first step, and I have a model to work with. Again, that's not a situation today. So we do need the model to actually expand people's imagination of who can negotiate and how to negotiate. Otherwise, we're in a lot of trouble.
Thank you very much. This was provocative, but also eye-opening. We leave with a lot of interesting ideas. So thanks. Let's applaud Mark Freeman for this wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much.